47 American soldiers dead that morning. Same valley, same fog, same German guns hidden in the treeline. Then the shooting stops. A white flag appears. A tall German officer waves it toward the American lines. Private First Class Miller stands up. He lowers his M1. He thinks the killing is over. He thinks he gets to go home. He is wrong. So is every man in that valley. 20 miles back, General George Patton grabs a radio. His men are relieved. His officers are ready to accept the surrender. But Patton doesn't smile. He doesn't relax. He sees what nobody else sees. His order shocks the entire command. Do not accept that flag. Open fire. Blow them to hell. That order should have ended Patton's career. It should have sent him to prison for murder. Instead, it saved over 2,000 American lives. Here is what Patton saw in those frozen woods, and why the German white flag was the deadliest lie of the entire war. Late 1944, the Western Front, the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. The American infantrymen of the Third Army had been fighting for weeks without rest. Sleep came in 30-minute bursts between artillery barrages. Hot food was a memory. Dry socks were a fantasy. The men lived in mud so deep it swallowed their boots up to their ankles. They shivered through freezing rain that turned to sleet that turned to snow. Their fingers were numb around their rifle triggers. Their eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion. Private First Class Miller had been in combat for 72 straight hours. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. He had watched his best friend die the morning before. A sniper's bullet through the neck while they were sharing a cigarette. Miller had dragged the body back to the aid station himself. He didn't cry. He didn't have the energy to cry. The battle was relentless. German 88mm anti-tank guns were positioned on the high ground surrounding the valley. Every time an American Sherman tank tried to advance, the Germans would fire from elevated positions. The tanks would brew up. The crews would burn alive inside their steel coffins. The infantry would have to retreat. Then the Germans would reposition. Then the Americans would try again. It was a grinding, brutal, and exhausting cycle. The Germans were retreating, but they were not broken. Far from it. They were fighting a highly organized delaying action. Their strategy was simple: make the Americans pay in blood for every inch of ground. The German high command knew they were losing the war. They knew the Allies would eventually cross the Rhine and march into Berlin. But they didn't care about winning anymore. They only cared about slowing the Americans down. Every day the Americans were stuck in this frozen valley was a day the Germans could reinforce their positions deeper inside Germany. For the American infantrymen, the psychological toll was unbearable. You fight for hours. Your friends are dying around you. You are running out of ammunition. You are running out of hope. The noise is deafening. The smell of smoke and cordite and blood fills your nostrils. You cannot escape it. You cannot close your eyes without seeing the faces of the men you lost. And then suddenly the guns stop firing. The deafening roar of battle fades away. The explosions stop. The machine gun fire stops. An eerie, uncomfortable silence settles over the field. It is the kind of silence that feels unnatural. Wrong. The silence is almost louder than the noise was. The American soldiers peek over the edge of their foxholes. Through the thick fog, shapes begin to emerge from the dark treeline. German soldiers, but they are not shooting. Their rifles are pointed at the ground. Their hands are raised. One of them, a tall officer, is waving something in the air. A piece of white cloth tied to a rifle barrel. A white flag, the universal symbol of surrender. The symbol of peace. For a young American GI freezing in the mud, that white flag is the most beautiful thing in the world. It means the killing is over. It means he gets to live another day. It means he will see his family again. He will go home. He will sleep in a bed. He will eat a hot meal. He will not die in this frozen hell. The American soldiers start to lower their M1 Garand rifles. They stand up from their positions. They stretch their aching legs. Some of them light cigarettes with trembling fingers. They look at each other with tired eyes that say, "We made it. It's finally over." They don't see the trap. They are too tired to see it. Their brains are too exhausted to process the danger. But 20 miles away, in a mobile command post, General George S. Patton sees everything they cannot see. 20 miles behind the frozen valley, General George S. Patton sat inside a mobile command post. It was a cramped, rattling trailer mounted on the back of a truck. Maps covered every available surface. Radio operators sat hunched over their equipment, listening to static and fragmented reports from the front lines. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and diesel fumes. Patton himself was dressed in his signature style: highly polished cavalry boots, pressed riding breeches, and ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He looked less like a general and more like a gunslinger from the Old West. That was how he wanted to look. That was how he wanted to be perceived. When the radio crackled to life with news of the white flag, Patton did not smile. He did not relax. He did not lean back in his chair and light a victory cigar. Instead, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. He stared at the tactical map spread out before him. His eyes traced the contours of the terrain. The Americans were pushing through a narrow valley. The valley floor was exposed, open, flat. There was no cover for infantry. There was no maneuvering room for tanks. The Germans held the high ground on both sides. It was the perfect position for a defensive ambush. Patton's mind began to race. The Americans were advancing quickly. The Sherman tanks were moving faster than the German infantry could retreat. The Germans were losing men. They were losing equipment. They were losing momentum. The Americans were overwhelming them in direct combat. But then Patton looked closer at the map. He traced the tree lines. He marked the positions of the German artillery batteries. He calculated the angles of fire. So why were these Germans suddenly surrendering? Patton looked at the terrain again. The Germans held the high ground. They had the advantage. They had the firepower. They had the defensive position. They should have been fighting harder, not waving white flags. Unless Patton's eyes narrowed. Unless the surrender wasn't real. Unless the white flag was a stall tactic. His mind flashed through the sequence of events. The American tanks would stop. The infantry would stand up. The forward momentum would die. The officers would walk forward to negotiate the surrender. The German artillery crews would get exactly what they needed: time. Patton grabbed a pencil and started drawing lines on the map. He marked where the German artillery batteries were positioned. He marked where they would need to be to hit the American column. He marked the kill zone. The valley was the kill zone. If the Americans accepted the ceasefire, they would be sitting ducks. Tanks would be stuck in the open. Infantry would be exposed on the flat ground. The German artillery would zero in. The 88 MMS would open fire. The American column would be destroyed, and the Germans would retreat deeper into the woods, ready to do it again tomorrow. The white flag wasn't a symbol of peace. It was a stopwatch, and if the Americans waited for it to hit zero, they would be slaughtered. Patton didn't guess this. He knew it. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had dedicated his entire life to understanding the enemy. He knew it with the conviction of a general who had seen too many American boys die because their commanders were too polite. He grabbed the radio microphone. His voice was calm, steady, and absolutely certain. He was about to issue an order that would make him look like a monster. But he didn't care. Patton grabbed the field telephone. His hand was steady. His voice was steel. The connection crackled. A young officer on the ground answered. He was a major, 28 years old, exhausted, covered in mud, and desperate for good news. When he heard Patton's voice, he expected congratulations. He expected a pat on the back for securing a surrender. He expected the general to say, "Good work, bring them in." What he got instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Major," Patton said, "do not accept the surrender. Do not let your men lower their weapons. Tell the forward units to keep firing. Blow them to hell." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The major thought he had misheard. He thought the static had garbled the transmission. He thought his exhaustion was playing tricks on his ears. "General," the major finally said. His voice was hesitant, uncertain, afraid. "General, they are unarmed. They are walking toward us with a white flag. Some of them have their hands raised. We can see their rifles are slung over their shoulders. They are not a threat. We are supposed to accept surrender. It is the rules of war." Patton's voice cut through the static like a whip. Cold, ruthless, absolute. I don't care if they are carrying a choir book. It is a trap. If you stop your tanks in that valley, they will zero in their artillery and blow your turrets off. Ignore the flag. Keep the armor moving forward. Fire at will. The major hesitated again. He could hear the desperation in his own voice. He was not a coward. He had earned his promotion through blood and bravery. But this order was different. This was not about tactical maneuvers. This was about morality. He knew his career could be destroyed, and he was willing to accept all of it. The major took a deep breath. His mind was racing. He thought about the men in his command. He thought about their faces. He thought about the families waiting for them in small towns across America. He thought about the mothers who had already received telegrams. He thought about the mothers who would still receive telegrams if he followed Patton's order. But he also thought about the mothers who would never receive telegrams, because Patton's order might save their sons. The major made his choice. Yes, General. I understand. We will attack. Patton put down the telephone. He did not smile. He did not relax. He sat back in his chair and stared at the map. His face was carved from stone. He had just risked everything. His career, his legacy, his freedom, all of it was on the line. All of it could be destroyed in a single headline. But he had made his decision, and he would live with the consequences. On the ground, the major relayed the order to his company commanders. They responded with shock. They responded with confusion. Some of them argued. Some of them refused to believe what they were hearing. One captain said, "We cannot do this. This is a war crime. We are going to prison." The major looked at the captain. His voice was calm. His voice was Patton's voice. "General Patton takes full responsibility. We attack. Now." The order rippled down the line. American soldiers who had been relaxing, lighting cigarettes, and standing up from their foxholes suddenly received new instructions. Load high-explosive shells. Advance. They looked at the German flag. They looked at the unarmed soldiers walking toward them. They looked at each other. And then they moved forward. The order rippled through the American lines like an electric shock. Soldiers who had been standing upright moments earlier dropped back into their positions. Cigarettes were thrown to the mud. M1 Garens were raised. Machine gunners tightened their grips on their weapons. The Sherman tank commanders slammed their hatches shut and gunned their engines. The low rumble of diesel engines filled the valley. On the American lines, confusion and disbelief warred with discipline. These were not robots. These were young men from farms and factories, from small towns and big cities. They had watched their friends die. They had smelled the burning flesh of tank crews. They had heard the screams of wounded men calling for their mothers. They were exhausted. They were traumatized. They wanted the war to end. And now they were being ordered to fire on men who were waving a white flag. Private First Class Miller stared at the German officer walking toward him. The officer was tall, arrogant, immaculately dressed despite the mud. He was carrying the white flag high above his head. He looked calm, confident, almost amused. Miller felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his M1 Garand. His hand was shaking. He looked at the men beside him. They were shaking too. Some of them were crying. Some of them were whispering prayers. One young soldier from Ohio was muttering, "I can't do this. I can't do this. They are surrendering. They are unarmed." The major who had spoken to Patton walked down the line. His voice was hoarse. His eyes were red. He had been awake for 3 days. He had buried 12 of his men that morning. "Listen to me," he shouted. "General Patton says this is a trap. He says there is artillery in those woods. He says if we stop, we die. I trust that man with my life. I trust him with your lives. Now fix bayonets and advance." That is an order. The soldiers moved forward. Their feet squelched in the frozen mud. Their breath came out in white clouds. The German officer with the white flag was now only 50 yards away. He was waving the flag more frantically. He was shouting something in German. He looked confused. He looked angry. He had expected the Americans to stop. He had expected them to lower their weapons. He had expected them to be gentlemen. Instead, the Sherman tanks lurched forward. The diesel engines roared. The tank treads churned through the mud. The machine guns on the turrets rotated toward the treeline. The German officer dropped the white flag. He turned and ran back toward the woods. His soldiers followed. They dove into the mud. They grabbed weapons hidden beneath the frozen ground. Submachine guns, stick grenades, Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. The trap was failing. The Germans had been caught off guard. The Americans opened fire. Rifle shots cracked through the freezing air. Machine guns sent streams of tracer rounds into the treeline. The Sherman tanks fired high-explosive shells directly into the German positions. The impact shook the ground. The shockwaves rattled the teeth in the soldiers' mouths. German soldiers screamed. Some of them tried to surrender for real. Some of them raised their hands. But the Americans were not stopping. They were advancing. They were pushing through the valley. They were smashing through the treeline. The momentum was unstoppable. Inside the tanks, the crews worked in a feverish rhythm. Loader feeding shells, gunner aiming, commander shouting coordinates. The smell of cordite and diesel filled the cramped compartments. The tank commanders pushed forward, ignoring the fire coming from the woods. One Sherman tank drove directly over a German machine gun position. The treads crushed the gun and the men operating it. The Americans did not slow down. They did not stop to take prisoners. They did not negotiate. They were following Patton's order. Ignore the flag. Keep moving. Tech. And then they smashed through the treeline. What they found on the other side made them gasp. Even the hardened tank commanders felt their blood run cold. Rows of German 88mm anti-tank guns stretched across the forest floor. Dozens of them. Massive, deadly, perfectly positioned. The German artillery crews were frantically trying to set them up. The barrels were half-raised. The shells were stacked nearby. They had been caught in the middle of their setup. They were minutes away from being ready to fire. Minutes away from destroying the entire American column. The American tanks smashed through the treeline like a battering ram through a door. What they saw stopped them cold. Even the most battle-hardened tank commanders felt their stomachs drop. Even the machine gunners stopped firing for a split second. Even the infantrymen, running behind the tanks, froze in their tracks. Rows of German 88mm anti-tank guns stretched across the forest floor. Not one, not two, dozens of them. They were lined up in perfect firing positions. They were aimed directly at the valley where the Americans had been standing just minutes earlier. The barrels were half-raised, pointing at the exact spot where the American column would have stopped to negotiate the surrender. The German artillery crews were caught completely off guard. They had been working frantically to set up their weapons. They had assumed they had 20 more minutes. They had assumed the white flag would buy them the time they needed. They had assumed the Americans would follow the rules of war. They were wrong. German soldiers scrambled in every direction. Some of them dove for cover. Some of them grabbed rifles and tried to return fire. Some of them simply stood frozen, staring at the American tanks in disbelief. The arrogance that had made them believe the trap would work was now their undoing. The American tank commanders did not hesitate. Patton's order was fresh in their minds. They had seen the white flag. They had questioned the order. They had almost disobeyed. But now, staring at these massive guns, they understood everything. The Sherman tanks opened fire at point-blank range. High-explosive shells slammed into the German artillery positions. The first round hit an 88mm gun dead center. The explosion sent shrapnel flying in all directions. The German crew was obliterated instantly. The gun barrel twisted into a useless piece of metal. Another tank fired. Another 88mm gun exploded. The ammunition stacked nearby cooked off, sending secondary explosions roaring through the forest. The shockwave knocked American infantrymen off their feet. The heat was intense. The noise was deafening. The German artillery crews tried to return fire. Some of them managed to get a single round off. But they were firing in desperation. They were firing without proper aiming. The shells went wide. They hit trees. They exploded harmlessly in the mud. They were too slow, too panicked, too caught off guard. The American tanks advanced through the forest, firing as they moved. They targeted every 88mm gun they could see. They did not stop to take prisoners. They did not stop to identify targets. They simply fired, and fired, and fired. German soldiers screamed. Some of them ran deeper into the forest. Some of them threw down their weapons and raised their hands. This time, the surrender was real. The Americans accepted it. But they did not stop advancing. They kept pushing forward. The infantry followed the tanks. Browning automatic rifles chattered. The Americans moved with a ferocity they had not felt in weeks. The exhaustion was gone. The fear was gone. They were soldiers again. They were hunters. Within minutes, the German ambush force was completely destroyed. The 88mm guns were twisted wrecks. The artillery crews were dead or captured. The ammunition was spent. The entire operation, the white flag, the trap, the plan to slaughter American boys, had collapsed in a matter of moments. The American soldiers walked through the smoking German positions. They stared at the massive anti-tank guns. They stared at the boxes of ammunition stacked and ready. They stared at the aiming coordinates that had been calculated for the valley. They realized how close they had come to disaster. If they had paused, if they had stopped their tanks in the open field, if they had sent out officers to negotiate the surrender, those 88 MMS would have opened fire. Dozens of American tanks would have been turned into burning coffins. Hundreds of GIs would have been torn apart by shrapnel in the open field. They would have died in a trap. They would have died thinking they were safe. They would have died trusting a white flag. But because Patton ordered them to keep moving, the Americans caught the artillery crews with their pants down. They destroyed the 88s before the Germans could even pull the lanyards. They crushed the ambush before it could happen. The false surrender wasn't just a stall tactic. It was a coordinated, arrogant, and deadly trap. The German officers thought the Americans were soft. They thought the Americans would blindly follow the rules of war. They thought they could slaughter American boys and retreat to fight another day. They didn't realize they were fighting George S. Patton. When the smoke finally cleared, the valley fell into an uneasy silence. The gunfire stopped. The explosions ceased. The screams of the wounded faded into muffled groans. The only sounds were the crackling of burning ammunition and the heavy breathing of exhausted soldiers. The acrid smell of cordite, diesel, and burning flesh hung thick in the freezing air. The American soldiers walked through the smoking German positions in a daze. Their boots crunched over shattered glass and twisted metal. They stepped over broken bodies. They passed burning wreckage. They looked at the destruction with hollow eyes. Then they saw the 88mm guns. Dozens of them, massive, deadly, rows of them stretching through the forest. Some were still intact. Some were twisted wrecks. All of them were aimed at where the Americans had been standing just minutes earlier. Private First Class Miller walked up to one of the guns. He touched the cold metal barrel. He looked down the sight. His mind did the math. His body went cold. The gun was aimed directly at the exact spot where he had been standing. The exact spot where he had lowered his rifle. The exact spot where he had lit a cigarette. The exact spot where he had thought the war was over. If Patton had not given the order, if the major had hesitated, if the tanks had stopped for even 5 minutes, this gun would have fired. The shell would have landed right on top of Miller. He would have been vaporized. No body to send home. No grave to visit. Just a telegram to his mother telling her he was missing in action. Miller dropped to his knees. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just knelt there in the mud, staring at the gun that almost killed him. His hands were shaking. His teeth were chattering. He could not stop shaking. The young major who had spoken to Patton walked through the wreckage. His face was pale. His eyes were wide. He looked at the 88mm guns. He looked at the stacked ammunition. He looked at the aiming coordinates that had been scrawled on a piece of paper next to one of the guns. He understood everything. He understood that his own sense of decency had almost gotten him and his men killed. He understood that his hesitation on the phone, his questioning of Patton's order, could have cost the lives of every soldier in his command. He understood that he had been moments away from making the worst mistake of his life. He had wanted to be honorable. He had wanted to follow the rules. He had wanted to be a gentleman in a war that had no gentlemen. And that decency had almost been his death warrant. The major walked back to his command post. He found the field telephone. He lifted the receiver and called Patton. "General," the major said. His voice was hoarse. His eyes were wet. "You were right. The Germans had 88s hidden in the woods. Dozens of them. They were minutes away from firing. We would have been slaughtered." Patton's voice crackled through the receiver. It was calm, steady, untroubled. "I know, Major. I know." The major paused. He had to ask the question. He had to know. "General, how did you know? How could you be so certain? You couldn't see the guns. You couldn't see the setup. You were 20 miles away. How did you know?" Patton was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost sad. "Because I know the enemy, Major. I have studied them my entire life. I know how they think. I know how they fight. I know what they do when they are desperate. The white flag was not surrender. It was a stopwatch. And I knew exactly how much time they needed." The major nodded. He couldn't see Patton, but he could feel the weight of the man's presence. "General, I almost disobeyed you. I almost stopped the advance. I almost killed my own men because I was afraid to break the rules." Patton's voice hardened slightly. "Rules are for peacetime, Major. In war, there is only one rule: win. If you hesitate, you die. If you are polite, you die. If you give the enemy time, you die. I would rather be called a monster by politicians in Washington than have to write letters to hundreds of mothers telling them their sons are dead because I was too polite to attack." The major closed his eyes. "Yes, General. I understand now." He put down the phone and looked at the smoking battlefield. He looked at his men, still alive, still breathing, still standing. They had almost died, but they hadn't. And it was because of a general who was willing to be hated to save them. The major understood something he would carry for the rest of his life. War was not a game. War was not a gentleman's duel. War was survival. And sometimes survival required ruthlessness. The incident in the Frozen Valley was never reported to the American public. No newspaper headlines. No radio broadcasts. No newsreels shown in movie theaters across the country. The U.S. Army made a deliberate decision to bury the story. The official record of the battle mentioned German casualties and American advances. It did not mention the white flag. It did not mention Patton's order. It did not mention the 88mm guns hidden in the woods. The military brass in Washington understood the optics. If the story leaked, it would be a public relations nightmare. The headlines would write themselves. General orders men to fire on white flag. American war crimes in Europe. The enemy propagandists would have a field day. The neutral nations would condemn the United States. The politicians would demand investigations. The courts-martial would follow. Patton's career would be destroyed. His reputation would be shredded. The man who had helped liberate Europe would be remembered as a butcher. The army could not allow that. Patton was too valuable. He was a symbol of American resolve. He was the general who had driven the Germans across France. He was the general who had saved the Americans at the Battle of the Bulge. He was the general who the troops loved and the Germans feared. He was irreplaceable, so the story was suppressed. The reporters who accompanied the Third Army were told to focus on other aspects of the battle: the advance, the captured equipment, the number of German prisoners. The reporters complied. They knew the rules. They knew what they could write and what they could not. They knew that criticizing Patton would mean losing access to the front lines. So they wrote what they were told to write. The soldiers who had been there did not talk about it either. Not because they were ordered to remain silent, but because they understood. They understood that the outside world would never understand. They understood that civilians in America, safe and warm in their homes, could never comprehend the brutality of the battlefield. They understood that the people back home would judge them without knowing the full story. So they kept their mouths shut. But the soldiers never forgot. They carried the memory of that day with them for the rest of their lives. They remembered the white flag. They remembered the hesitation. They remembered the order. They remembered the 88mm guns. They remembered the smoking wreckage. They remembered that Patton had saved their lives by breaking the rules. To the politicians in Washington, Patton was a liability, a loose cannon, a man who was too reckless, too aggressive, too willing to ignore the rules of war. They tolerated him because he won battles, but they never trusted him. They never fully supported him. They were always waiting for the moment when he would finally go too far. To the soldiers of the Third Army, Patton was something else entirely. He was a savior. He was a father figure. He was the man who had seen the trap when no one else could. He was the man who had risked everything. His career, his freedom, his reputation, to protect them. He was the man who had accepted the burden of moral judgment so that they could live to see their families again. The incident in the valley was proof of something that the soldiers already knew. Patton was not fighting for promotions. He was not fighting for medals. He was not fighting for headlines. He was fighting for his men. He would do whatever it took to bring them home alive, even if it meant breaking every rule in the book. The white flag incident was not heavily publicized. But in the unofficial history of the Third Army, it was legendary. The men told the story to each other. They told it to new replacements. They told it to their children after the war. They whispered it in bars and at reunions. Patton ordered us to fire on a white flag. We thought he was crazy. We thought he was a monster. But he was right. He was always right. The army buried the truth. But the soldiers who survived that valley never forgot. And neither did the Germans. The false surrender had failed. The trap had been crushed. And the German officers who had planned the ambush realized that they could not fool Patton. They had tried to use the rules of war as a weapon. They had tried to use American decency as a weakness. They had tried to turn honor into a death sentence. They had failed, because they were fighting a man who had already made peace with being hated. A man who cared more about the lives of his soldiers than his legacy. A man who understood that in war, sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is break the rules to save the innocent. The frozen valley taught the men of the Third Army a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. It was a lesson that went beyond tactics, beyond strategy, beyond the mechanics of war. It was a lesson about the nature of honor, the price of decency, and the cruel mathematics of survival. War is not a gentleman's game played on a chessboard. This is the truth that the German officers had forgotten. Or perhaps they had never understood it at all. They believed in rules. They believed in the Geneva Convention. They believed that the Americans would follow the code of honor because they were weak, because they were soft, because they had not yet learned the brutal reality of total war. The Germans were wrong. The Geneva Convention exists to protect the innocent. It exists to protect the defeated. It guaranteed that in the future, Americans would hesitate to accept real surrenders from honest German soldiers. And the honest German soldiers would pay the price for the arrogance of their officers. Patton understood this cold logic better than anyone. He understood that the white flag was not just a threat to his men on that day. It was a threat to the entire concept of surrender. It was a threat to the very fabric of the rules of war. If the Germans could use the white flag as a trap, then no one could ever trust a white flag again. And if no one could trust a white flag, then soldiers would die. Not just American soldiers, German soldiers too. Soldiers who genuinely wanted to surrender. Soldiers who wanted to survive. Soldiers who would be cut down because their countrymen had destroyed the symbol of surrender. Patton valued results over formal military etiquette. He valued the lives of his men over his own reputation. He valued victory over appearances. He was willing to bear the moral stain of a controversial order so that mothers in America wouldn't have to receive folded flags. He wasn't fighting for a clean record. He was fighting for total, overwhelming victory. And on that muddy field against arrogant officers who thought they could play him for a fool, Patton proved that while you might be able to trick an American soldier, you can never ever trick the old man. The lesson of the Valley is one that applies far beyond the battlefield. It applies to any situation where rules are used as a shield. It applies to any situation where decency is exploited as a weakness. It applies to any situation where the moral high ground becomes a trap. The lesson is this: decency is not a weakness, but decency without vigilance is a death sentence. Honor is not foolishness, but honor without cunning is suicide. The rules exist to protect the good, but if the bad use the rules against the good must be willing to fight back. Not with cruelty, not with brutality, but with the clear-eyed understanding that survival sometimes requires ruthlessness. The frozen valley fell silent. The smoke drifted away. The guns cooled. The soldiers counted their living and buried their dead. The war continued, but the men who survived that day would never forget. They would never forget the white flag. They would never forget Patton's voice crackling through the radio. They would never forget the moment they smashed through the treeline and saw the 88mm guns aimed at where they had been standing. They would never forget that their own decency had almost killed them. And they would never forget that a ruthless old general had saved their lives by breaking every rule in the book. The story of the white flag trap became legend. It was whispered in foxholes. It was told in bars after the war. It was passed down from father to son. It became part of the unofficial history of the Third Army. A story that the politicians in Washington tried to bury. A story that the newspapers never reported. A story that the American public never heard. But a story that the soldiers carried in their hearts. And the story carried a question that has no easy answer. A question that has haunted soldiers, generals, and philosophers for centuries. A question that cuts to the very heart of what it means to fight a war while trying to remain human. Do you follow the rules of war, even if it means risking the lives of your soldiers? This is the question that the white flag incident forces us to confront. It is not a simple question. It does not have a simple answer. On one side, the rules of war exist for a reason. They protect the innocent. They protect the defeated. They prevent the descent into total barbarism. They are the thin line that separates civilization from savagery. If we abandon the rules, what are we fighting for? If we become as ruthless as the enemy, how are we any different from them? But on the other side, what is the purpose of the rules if they are used as a weapon against you? What is the value of honor if it leads to the slaughter of your own men? What is the point of decency if it becomes a death sentence? And who bears the responsibility when soldiers die because their commander was too polite to take action? Patton made his choice. He chose his men over the rules. He chose survival over appearances. He chose victory over reputation. He was willing to be hated. He was willing to be condemned. He was willing to face a court-martial. He was willing to spend the rest of his life in prison. All of it. He was willing to give up everything to save the lives of the soldiers under his command. Was he right? The men of the Third Army thought so. Let us know your verdict in the comments. We want to hear what you think. We want to hear your perspective. We want to hear the debate, because this is a debate that matters. This is a debate that has shaped the course of history. And this is a debate that will continue to shape the future of warfare. And if you want to know what happened when the US Army captured the most evil woman in the Nazi Empire, click the video on your screen right now. That is a story you will not want to miss. A story of justice. A story of vengeance. A story of the darkest heart of the Third Reich. Thanks for watching. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your engagement. We appreciate your willingness to explore the unfiltered truth of history. Hit that subscribe button. We will see you in the next video.